The stars twinkled brightly against the endless expanse of space as the human ship drifted through the void. John Clark, a skilled mechanic, sat in the cockpit, his hands nervously gripping the controls. He had never thought he would end up here, far away from Earth, stranded on an unknown planet with a broken ship. His ship, the Titan, had crashed after a freak accident involving an uncharted asteroid belt. John had barely survived the crash, but the ship was beyond repair. It had taken everything out of him to get the craft functioning enough to land. His legs were bruised and sore from the impact, and his body ached from the rough landing. But it wasn't the physical pain that haunted him now. It was the isolation. The planet he had crash-landed on wasn't entirely uninhabited. That much John knew. There were distant signs of life. Strange sounds from the dense jungle outside and faint movements in the trees. Yet no one had come to his rescue. He had no idea how long it would take for him to be found, if at all. As he stepped out of the wrecked cockpit, his boots crunching on the dry, sandy ground, he glanced around. The environment was harsh, rocky terrain surrounded by an eerie quiet, the air thick with the scent of something foreign. His heart pounded. He had to find shelter, and soon. As he gathered his equipment, his eyes landed on something strange. In the distance, partially covered by some thick trees and debris, he saw an enormous ship, broken and rusted, but clearly much larger and older than his own. It was a structure made of sleek silver metal, a sharp contrast to the rough surroundings. Curiosity tugged at him. He needed to know more. John decided to head in its direction. The journey was long and difficult, but he managed to reach the wreckage as night fell. The sight before him was unsettling. It was clear that this was no ordinary ship. Its outer structure was alien, sleek, with strange symbols etched into the metal. But that wasn't what grabbed his attention. It was what lay beside the wreckage. A woman. She was unlike anything John had ever seen. Her skin was a shade of blue he couldn't describe, and her long white hair flowed as if in the wind, though there was no breeze. She lay unconscious, her body battered and covered in strange glowing markings, as if she had been thrown from the wreckage. John knelt beside her, heart racing. He didn't know if she was alive. Her chest rose and fell slowly, a sign of life. But she was hurt. It wasn't just the ship that was shattered. She, too, seemed broken. Her armor was torn, and there were cuts on her exposed skin. As John's hand hovered near her, a sense of urgency hit him. This was no time to hesitate. He had to help. He scanned the area, finding some tools among the wreckage of his own ship. He quickly fashioned a makeshift stretcher from some metal beams and cloth, carefully lifting her. His mind raced. How would he fix her ship? How could he save her? The woman stirred as he carried her, and her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze locked onto him, filled with confusion and fear. "I'm here to help," John said softly, though his voice was shaky. He wasn't sure if she understood him, but he hoped his sincerity would reach her. "I'll fix your ship. I promise." For the first time since the crash, John felt a strange connection, a spark of hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the vast distance between their worlds, he was determined to help her. She had no reason to trust him, but something deep within him told him that helping her might be the only thing that would fix the shattered pieces of his own soul. The journey ahead was unknown, but it was a journey John would take with her, one step at a time. John carefully navigated through the dense, alien jungle, the woman in his arms. The weight of her wasn't much, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead felt heavy. His ship had been reduced to scrap, and this planet, with its strange sky and terrifyingly unfamiliar terrain, felt more like a nightmare than a place for refuge. The woman stirred again in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin still had an unnatural coldness to it. John could feel the slight tremble in her body as he moved. It wasn't clear if she was awake, but her grip on his sleeve tightened ever so slightly. "I won't leave you," John whispered, mostly to himself. The words felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't spoken to anyone for days. The silence of the crash had haunted him, But now, with her there, he didn't feel as alone. He didn't know who she was, or what kind of being she belonged to, but he knew she needed help. Hours passed as he navigated the jungle, the sun setting behind the distant mountains, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. The path was rugged, but John had experience with difficult terrains, and his instincts pushed him forward. Finally, he reached a small clearing. In the distance, he could see the outline of his own wrecked ship, but the alien ship, her ship, stood at the heart of the forest, partially buried in the earth. The destruction was significant, but John could see the potential for repair. He knelt down, gently placing the woman on the ground. She let out a soft groan, but didn't open her eyes. John quickly scanned his surroundings. There was wreckage scattered across the clearing, tools he could use, and some of his own supplies scattered among the debris. His mind began to race. How could he help her? He didn't have the advanced technology she needed, but he had to try. John grabbed his basic tools and approached her ship cautiously. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The exterior was sleek, metallic, and covered in strange symbols that he couldn't even begin to decipher. He took a deep breath and set to work, stripping away the broken panels and looking for any signs of life support systems. The damage was extensive, but not irreparable. His mechanical knowledge from working on Earth ships was useful, but he knew this was far beyond anything he had ever dealt with. As he worked, John occasionally glanced back at the woman. Her expression had softened, and her breathing, while still faint, seemed to stabilize. He wasn't sure how long she'd been unconscious, or if the damage to her body was critical, but there was something about her, something that made him want to keep going. There were strange markings on her body, faint scars across her skin. They looked like some kind of tribal tattoo, but they were more than just decoration. They pulsed with a faint light whenever he got too close. It was almost like they were alive. He continued working, hands shaking with fatigue but driven by an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She had trusted him, even if she didn't know him. She was injured, alone, and desperate, just like him. "Hold on," he whispered as he tightened a panel into place. "I'll get you back on your feet." John wasn't sure how he'd fix everything, but the one thing he knew for certain was that this woman, whoever she was, had found her way into his life, and there was no going back now. John wiped the sweat from his brow as he worked. The sun was now almost fully set, casting long shadows across the alien landscape. The sound of distant animals echoed through the trees, adding an eerie backdrop to the quiet intensity of his task. The woman was still unconscious, her breathing slow but steady. John had placed her near the remains of her ship, hoping it would provide some kind of protection against the elements. As he worked on the damaged ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. Every movement of his hands seemed like it needed to be faster, more precise. He didn't know what would happen if he couldn't fix her ship in time, but the desperation in his chest told him that the consequences wouldn't be good. He had already made some progress. A few of the ship's systems had come back online after he had bypassed some damaged circuits. The more he worked, the more fascinated he became with the alien technology. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The materials were lighter but stronger than anything Earth had, and the energy systems seemed to work in ways he couldn't begin to understand. But despite his knowledge, he still had one major hurdle to overcome: the power source. John paused for a moment, rubbing his tired eyes. He turned back to the woman. She was lying on a bed of rocks, her chest rising and falling with each slow breath. The markings on her skin, which he had first thought were tattoos, now looked like glowing veins, pulsing with an ethereal light. He wasn't sure what they meant, but it was clear they were important. They seemed to be connected to her very life force, and the more they pulsed, the more he understood that she was far from ordinary. He turned back to the ship, a sense of determination filling him. He had to finish this. There was no other choice. As he worked through the night, making repairs as best as he could, John couldn't help but think of the woman. Her presence was like a puzzle he couldn't solve, but he was drawn to it. He didn't know what had happened to her before the crash, but he knew it had been brutal. Her clothes were torn and stained with some kind of substance, and her face had a haunted look, as though she had seen things no one should ever have to experience. A sudden sharp noise broke through his thoughts. He turned around quickly, his heart racing. The woman was sitting up, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She looked around, taking in the strange surroundings, and then her gaze locked onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. She was still trying to understand what had happened, just as John was. He stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do. Where am I?" Her voice was soft, but there was a strong undertone to it, a strength that John hadn't expected from someone who appeared so fragile. John swallowed, trying to steady his breath. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady. I found you after the crash." She blinked, her blue eyes flashing with a mix of confusion and recognition. "You helped me," she whispered. John nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. It was the first time he had heard her speak, and hearing her voice made everything feel real. "Yes, I'm here to help. We'll get you home." The woman looked at him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to piece together the truth of his words. Then, without warning, she reached out a hand, her fingers lightly brushing his arm. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." John looked at her, a mixture of emotions rushing through him. He couldn't help but feel a connection to her, a bond that went beyond the simple act of rescue. There was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that made him want to protect her at all costs. "I'll make sure you're okay," he said quietly. "I won't leave you." And for the first time since the crash, he felt like he wasn't alone in this strange, alien world. As the morning sun began to rise, casting long golden beams over the wreckage, John sat beside the ship, wiping his hands on his pants. His fingers ached, his mind tired, but the work was far from over. The woman had fallen back into unconsciousness, though her breath had become more regular, less shallow than before. He watched her closely, wondering what kind of life she had led before crashing here. Her glowing blue skin and the strange symbols etched into her body suggested she wasn't from anywhere on Earth. John's eyes drifted back to the ship, a twisted mass of metal and wires. It was almost as if it had a personality of its own, a kind of defiance that resonated with the life force of the woman lying nearby. He didn't understand it, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to fix this ship. If he didn't, they both might not make it. The strange alien energy source had proven even more difficult than he had imagined. It pulsed with a life of its own, and when John tried to link it to the ship's systems, it had surged violently, causing him to be thrown back by the force. The energy was far beyond anything he had encountered in his years of working with machines, but there was something about this, the connection between the energy and the woman, that felt different. She had been unconscious for hours now, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow tied to the very ship he was trying to repair. But what could that connection be? What had happened to her? As John worked late into the morning, his focus narrowing to every click and hum of the ship's circuits, a quiet voice broke through his thoughts. Where am I?" The woman's voice was faint, but it cut through the stillness like a beacon. John's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly to see her slowly sitting up, her hands braced against the dirt-covered ground. Her glowing blue eyes blinked, adjusting to the light as she looked around, taking in her surroundings. "You're safe," John said, standing and walking toward her slowly. "You were hurt, but I'm here now. You're safe." The woman's gaze shifted to him. For a moment, there was silence between them. Her eyes, full of confusion and hesitation, searched his face, as if trying to piece together her fragmented memory. I don't remember." She trailed off, her voice a whisper. John crouched down in front of her. "It's okay. You were in a crash, I found you. I've been working on fixing the ship. It's gonna be okay." She blinked, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The panic in her eyes started to subside, replaced by a flicker of something else. Gratitude, or maybe curiosity. Slowly, she placed a hand on her chest, where the strange markings seemed to pulse beneath the surface of her skin. I don't know who you are, but I can feel your kindness. I think I owe you my life." John wasn't sure what to say. The situation was strange, far beyond anything he'd ever faced, but her words struck him in a way he couldn't explain. "I'm just a guy who wants to help," he said with a soft smile, though he wasn't sure what he was even smiling about. It felt so simple, yet so complicated. He didn't know where this was headed, but he couldn't deny the sense of connection he felt toward her. She looked at him, still processing the situation, and then shifted her focus to the ship. Her eyes lit up with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Her hand reached toward the ship, her fingertips just barely grazing the surface. "This ship, it's part of me," she said softly. "It's not just a ship, it's my home." John stood up, taking a step back. He had been so focused on getting it to work that he hadn't thought. Days had passed since John first found the woman among the wreckage of her ship. The repairs were slow, but they were progress. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, John would sit next to the alien woman, his tools by his side, and they would talk. Sometimes it was about the ship, sometimes about their worlds. But often, the conversation drifted into silence, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word being said. The woman, who had introduced herself as Lyra, had regained more of her strength each day. Her eyes, once clouded with confusion, now glimmered with a quiet intelligence, and though she was still cautious, her trust in John was growing. She watched as he worked tirelessly, his hands deftly fixing parts of the ship, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She had been so sure she was going to die alone on this barren world, but here he was, her unexpected savior. One evening, as John tightened the last screw on the ship's engine, Lyra stood behind him, watching in silence. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light over them, and the vast emptiness of the planet seemed a little less lonely. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. John paused for a moment, his hand still gripping the tool. He turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the fading light. "I'm just doing what anyone would have done," he replied, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. His desire to help her, to fix what was broken, went beyond simple duty. There was something about her, something he couldn't put into words, that made him want to protect her. Lyra met his gaze, her blue eyes full of depth and understanding. "No, John, not anyone would have done this. I've seen the way people treat those who are different. But you see me. You've saved me, and for that, I owe you." The ship hummed with life as the engines powered up. John stood next to Lyra, his hands resting on the controls, his eyes scanning the dimly lit cockpit. The view outside the glass was both alien and beautiful, a barren landscape of rocky terrain stretching as far as the eye could see, with distant mountains casting long shadows under the fading light of a red-orange sun. The air was thin, and the planet's atmosphere was harsh, but it had been home for far too long. Now, the ship was ready to take them away. Lyra sat next to him, her hands lightly brushing over the control panel. It was strange to her, the technology that was so advanced compared to her own people's, but she had learned quickly under John's careful teaching. He had guided her through each step, showing her how to repair the ship. The stars twinkled brightly outside the ship, a sea of endless possibilities stretching before them. John sat at the cockpit, hands gently resting on the controls. The quiet hum of the engines was a welcome sound, one that meant they were no longer stuck, no longer prisoners to the planet that had once held them captive. They were free, and it was because of Lyra. Turning his head, John glanced at her. She was sitting across from him, looking out the small window, her eyes filled with curiosity and wonder. Her blue skin, soft and radiant in the dim light of the ship, reflected the light from the stars. Her once sturdy but broken form had been repaired, her systems now functioning as they should. Yet it was more than just the mechanics of her being that had changed. She was different in ways that John could not fully describe. She had been strong from the beginning, but there was a gentleness in her now, something more human-like, something he had never expected. He had saved her, but in doing so, she had done something for him, something he had not realized he needed. She had mended the pieces of his soul that he had kept hidden for so long. Lyra turned her head, her eyes meeting his. There was a softness in them now, a depth that hadn't been there before. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" Her voice was almost a whisper, a soft question. It wasn't fear in her tone, but a sense of awe at the new life they were embarking on together. John nodded, his eyes reflecting the same wonder. "We are. Together." Her lips curved into a smile, and it was a smile that told him everything he needed to know. It wasn't the smile of someone who had survived by chance. It wasn't the smile of someone who was simply going through the motions. This was the smile of someone who had found hope. And in that smile, he saw his own hope reflected back at him. They were no longer the same people they had been when they first met. The dangers they had faced, the struggles they had overcome, had forged a bond between them. They had relied on each other in ways they had never thought possible. And now, as the ship sailed through the stars, they both knew that no matter where they went next, they would always have each other. Lyra reached over and touched his hand gently, the warmth of her touch a silent promise. Her fingers, delicate yet strong, brushed against his skin, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. The vastness of space, the unknown future, it all seemed insignificant. In this moment, they were simply two souls who had found one another. John squeezed her hand gently. He had been a loner for so long, trapped in his own world of pain and regret. But with her, there was no more loneliness. With Lyra, he felt a sense of belonging that he had never thought possible. "Whatever happens next," Lyra whispered, "we face it together." John smiled. Together. And as the ship moved deeper into the stars, they both knew that they had not only repaired the ship but had also fixed what was broken within each other. Their journey had just begun, and though the future remained uncertain, they no longer feared it. They had each other, and that was enough. The stars ahead were their future, waiting to be explored, and they would face whatever came, side by side.